The Alien series is by far one of my favorite franchises, from the films to the comics and of course the games, may that be the old school platformers on the Super Nintendo or more recent offerings like Isolation. In 2000 though, to coincide with the release of the movie, Resurrection was unleashed upon the PlayStation and pioneered the use of the dual analog sticks for first-person shooters on consoles. Apart from being an absolute dream to play, visually it was one of the system's most impressive titles that saw you taking up the role of Ripley and several other members of the ship's crew as you try to navigate and ultimately escape the nightmare. As with most survival horrors, ammo is a scarce commodity, so picking your shots and making sure they land is paramount, as it's all too easy to find yourself without a bullet to your name, and subsequently running into a xenomorph becomes a far more challenging ordeal. You do get a pistol with unlimited shots, but it's like pissing in the wind against some of the non-human enemies, but with a nice selection of different weapons on offer, from shotguns to flamethrowers and pulse rifles. As long as you've got the ammo, you'll always be able to stand your ground. Now visually, Alien Resurrection is easily one of the PlayStation's most graphically impressive games. From the dim-lit corridors that are only illuminated by destroyed flickering lights, to the designs of each of the enemies and the fluidity of how it all plays out is incredible to see up and running on the hardware. Sure, by today's standards it's pretty crude, but back then it really showcased what was possible on the system and the future of first-person shooters within the home console space. Tobal 2 was one of those games that never found its way outside of Japan, which was a bit of a surprise at the time due to the relative success of the first game, and it left many fans feeling frustrated. All the previous characters made a comeback as well as some new additions, but what really helped it stand out was the quest mode, which essentially turned the game into an RPG where you could improve your fighter's stats, explore the world, trade with merchants and acquire items that prolonged the experience well after you've finished with the arcade mode. Like most fighters, the gameplay is easy to get into, with each of the characters possessing a range of basic attacks as well as special moves, but this time around, more of a focus on linking your hits together was present, that resulted in some impressive combinations and juggles. Graphically, the game was a huge improvement over the original, with all of the fighters being made up of far more polygons, giving Akira Toriyama's designs much more life and character. The same attention to detail was afforded to the stages, and instead of just flat backgrounds, many of them are made up of different aspects, such as ruined castles, lush open fields and industrial sites that add a real personality and vibe to each location as the fight plays out. As well as all of this, it took advantage of the PlayStation's high-res mode and saw the game running at 640 by 480, which not many titles on the system did. When you couple this with the smooth and solid 60 frames per second during play, what you have is one of the most graphically impressive games on the PlayStation. Alongside Crash Bandicoot, Spyro stood as the gold standard when it came to platformers on the PlayStation, with the third entry being the last installment to be developed by Insomniac Games. Year of the Dragon didn't bring many radical changes to the formula, and many of the tried and tested gameplay mechanics remained intact, with it all being made up of 4 different worlds that each consist of several levels to complete. You get to control up to 4 different characters across the adventure, each of which all possess their own unique abilities, from those better at fighting to some that offer more ways to make your way through each level, such as having the ability to fly. The sheer variety of objectives and mini-games though is what really sees Year of the Dragon surpassing the earlier games in the series. From skateboarding to shootouts and racing, the game keeps you on your toes and constantly feels like it's dishing out new ideas, to the point where it never becomes routine or stale. Year of the Dragon carries on the tradition of Spyro games being some of the most graphically impressive titles available on the PlayStation. The only things detracting the game's amazing visuals are the shaky polygons and unfiltered textures that come with just about every PlayStation game imaginable, but even these imperfections are skillfully covered up. In comparison to his earlier versions, Spyro himself appears to be a little bit more detailed, while the other characters and enemies are also well developed and animated, especially the several facial expressions that accompany all of their actions. Platformer fans who pass this game over are doing themselves a disservice, as it's by far one of the best of its kind the PlayStation has to offer. Macross VFX2 is an action flight sim that shares much in common with the likes of Ace Combat and sees you jumping into a mech as you take to the skies to battle the ever-increasing threat of a terrorist group known as Black Rainbow. The game is split up into a series of missions that usually consist of one of two different objectives, that being seek and destroy or all-out combat, which bring your mech's abilities to the forefront. During flight, your ship can transform into 3 different states, with each mode giving you specific abilities. You've got the fighter, which offers the most speed and maneuverability, the Batroid that allows for far more greater accuracy, and finally the Gearwalk, which is basically a good mixture of the two. Transforming between these different states on the fly and assessing which mode is right for the current situation is essential to overcoming some of the more challenging moments the game presents. Admittedly, it can be a bit overwhelming trying to keep track of everything that goes on, but the game does try to offset this by giving the player the freedom to choose from one of 3 different viewpoints, as well as the ability to follow a specific target. When it comes to presentation, this is where Macross truly leaves its mark and sees you taking on missions that span cities, the skies, and even the vast emptiness of space. Each mech is intricately detailed and animates smoothly as you transform or weave in and out of combat, as the impressive missile trails and explosions fill the sky. Hammering this home is the frame rate, which holds at a steady 60 FPS no matter how intense each dogfight gets, and believe me, it's outright insanity at points. But the game's fluid motion will keep you locked in on the action, allowing you to soar through the skies and stay on top of the enemy. Overall, if you're a Macross fan, then VFX2 is something you do not want to miss. Xenogears is one of the PlayStation's most notorious RPGs that mixes sci-fi, fantasy, and philosophical elements into a truly unforgettable adventure. You take on the role of Fate and are witness to the destruction of your village by mysterious mechs and set out to get to the bottom of what happened and bring those responsible to justice. When it comes to gameplay, like many RPGs, you'll find yourself exploring the world and jumping into battle, which can play out in one of 2 different ways. The first is very much a traditional setup that sees you commanding your party and selecting from many different abilities, but further into the game you get the opportunity to acquire your own robot or gear that drastically changes the dynamics of each battle. They are far more powerful than the regular characters but operate on fuel, which must be taken into account during a fight, as each action you do costs a certain amount, which adds a nice level of strategy to the otherwise straightforward system. Now graphically, Xenogears opted out of the then popular pre-rendered setup and instead relied on fully rendered 3D environments for the player to explore, and even though a few issues with the game's camera would come about because of it, it was still an impressive approach for its time, with plenty of variation when it came to the different locations throughout the game. The high-res, fluidly animated 2D sprites for the characters and on for enemies are gorgeous, and interact seamlessly with the flashy 3D effects for their attacks. The use of polygons for all the large machines and gears is pretty well done, and gives each of them an imposing presence as they fight it out. Overall, Xenogears is not without its issues, but it's still one of the best adventures to experience on the PlayStation. Siphon Filter 3 was one of the last games to hit the PlayStation, and it felt like a real culmination of everything that Bend Studio had learnt up until that point, both in terms of gameplay and presentation, resulting in one of the most enjoyable stealth action shooters on the system. It sees you once again taking up the fight as Gabe and several other members of his team as they work towards clearing their name after a mission goes south. To be fair, the story is pretty lackluster compared to the other two, but in terms of gameplay it's much more in line with the original, and places a huge emphasis upon stealth across the 20 different missions that make up the game. Of course, it's not just all about sneaking around, as certain moments will call for you to go on the offensive, and you've got a huge array of imaginative options to do so, from standard pistols to sniper rifles and machine guns, as well as non-lethal weapons like the taser. Now when looking at the game from a visual perspective, Siphon Filter 3 absolutely pushes the PlayStation to its limits. The lush, expansive environments such as the jungle and bases you'll visit all possess great textures and lighting, and the highly detailed character models help it all come together to create a truly cinematic adventure, which is only bolstered by the incredible effects such as explosions and gunfire that make each exchange truly intense. One area where the game clearly excels though is the animation that feels fluid and realistic as you run through the battlefield, with Gabe reacting naturally to your movements as you hunt down the enemy. Although it never quite reaches the same quality as some of the other action games on the PlayStation like Metal Gear Solid, Siphon Filter 3 is still a really impressive game for its time. Dead or Alive has long been at the forefront when it comes to visuals, and the first entry on the PlayStation was no exception. Appearing in the arcades back in 1996 and receiving a port to the console in 98, it once again proved that Sony's grey little box was more than up to the challenge of translating the arcade experience perfectly. Like most fighters, you've got a generous selection of characters to choose from who all possess their own specific movesets and fighting styles, so giving each of them a go is a really good idea so you can settle into one that suits your approach. What really defines the game though, when put against others of its kind, is the speed and focus on countering. Where other fighters have you memorizing endless strings of combos, Dead or Alive approaches it a bit differently by putting an emphasis upon simple commands and the speed in which you can pull them off. Now in terms of visuals, the character models are extremely well detailed, easily rivaling those of the Tekken series, with their clothing being particularly impressive as loose pieces of fabric or their hair will sway in the wind and react realistically to the character's movements. Of course, playing this as a young teenager definitely had its advantages, and even though certain aspects of the characters' bodies are over-exaggerated, the physics in the game was something you wouldn't often see at the time and really contributed to the overall quality of the visual presentation. On top of the slick animation was the frame rate, which delivered a solid 60 FPS and never buckled under the pressure of some of the more demanding aspects of the visuals. Even though it's not the best fighting game in terms of gameplay on the system, there's no denying that the sheer technical mastery of Team Ninja was on full display. After the lukewarm reception of the game before it, Saga Frontier 2 set out to improve on nearly every aspect of it, and the result was one of the most unique RPGs to ever hit the PlayStation. Instead of only having one narrative to follow, the game presents two different stories, with one revolving around a prince in exile who's on a quest to reclaim his throne, and the other on the son of a rich family of diggers who's looking to obtain a mysterious treasure known only as the Egg. What really steals the show is the quality of the writing and the huge cast of nearly 50 characters you'll meet along the way who add a real weight to the events that transpire, making the world feel like a believable space as you move from town to town. In terms of combat, it plays out in a turn-based fashion and sees you having the choice of two different types of fighting. First, you've got one-on-one, where up to 4 commands can be linked together in your turn, and then you've got party, where you're joined by 3 other characters on the field. Unlike most RPGs that see you leveling up your characters, here in Saga Front 2, the progression is tied to your weapons, and the more you use them, the more proficient they become. Now, the visuals that make up the game are easily some of the most impressive you'll find on the system, and this is down to the hand-drawn style that the game deploys. It uses rich, hand-painted watercolors to create its characters and environments, and at points it looks like a painting in motion, as each of the characters in area you explore are made up of small, intricate details and animation that give each of them a real life of their own. Thanks to this approach, the game has stood the test of time and looks just as impressive as it did all those years ago. After the huge success of the first 2 games, it was a bit of a no-brainer that Crash would once again burst onto the PlayStation with an entirely new adventure that seemingly improved on not only the visuals, but several aspects of the gameplay as well. Just like the previous game, there's a sort of hub area that allows you to take on one of the many levels at your own pace, which sees you having to collect crystals that reside in each of them in order to move on. With about 25 of them in total, there's a good amount to make your way through, and that's not even counting the bosses, which mix up the gameplay and provide a real challenge for the player to overcome. Thankfully, Crash has got a few tricks up his sleeve, such as a spinning attack, a handy double jump, and a body slam that allow you to defend yourself against the ever-increasing amount of enemies in each level. One aspect where the game falls short though is with its difficulty, and when compared to the other 2 outings, it is incredibly easy. There are a few optional items to collect that pile on the challenge for those looking to get more out of it, but there's nothing that's going to test your patience like the first 2 games did. When it comes to graphics, Crash Warped is easily the most impressive in the series on the PlayStation, with nearly every aspect of the game being dialed up to 11 and a huge amount of detail being afforded to not only the characters, but throughout each and every level as well. From Egyptian to medieval and the futuristic, the variety in the game's design is what really sets it apart from others of its kind on the system. It really took advantage of the power that the PlayStation afforded, with incredible texture work, lighting and shadows. If you're looking for a platformer to jump into on the PlayStation, then Crash Warped is definitely worth checking out. Fist of the North Star is perhaps one of the most gruesome and action-packed beat-em-ups on the PlayStation that closely follows the events of the anime and sees you filling the role of Ken as you travel the wasteland fueled by vengeance. The gameplay is extremely simple and focuses on Ken's use of a deadly martial art that allows you to throw out several types of punches and kicks, as well as a selection of far deadlier special attacks that make short work of the bodybuilding jackasses that stop at nothing to try and defeat you. Each hit you land is accompanied by a bloody mess and captures the essence of the show perfectly as you deal out beatdown after beatdown. Even though it's an absolute blast to play in short bursts, the game can become quite repetitive after long periods of play, but it's nothing that completely ruins the game as a whole. It just would have been nice to have seen a bit more depth in the gameplay. Where Fist of the North Star really shines though is with its impressive visuals. Not only are there several fully realized polygonal characters on screen at any one time, but elaborately textured destroyed buildings and gang members cheering from the rooftops overshadow all of the action as it plays out. A good amount of different enemy types and designs are also present, as well as a wealth of different bosses that bring their own distinct personality to each encounter. When it comes down to it, Fist of the North Star was a great achievement on the PlayStation, and for what it lacked in terms of deep gameplay was more than made up for by its incredible presentation. Well, that does it for another video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos which release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials which are linked below to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with and to take part in giveaways. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters Rhino, Skill Jim, Shuden, Richard, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Terry, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, Fake and Patty J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to check the video out. I'll catch you next time.